If you have prayed the Rosary every single day for the last 10 years, Padre Pio had something to say to you directly, and what he said is not what you want to hear. In his final years at San Giovanni Rotondo, after decades of hearing confessions, sometimes 12 hours a day without pause, Padre Pio made a statement to one of his fellow friars that has circulated quietly in certain religious communities ever since. He said, "The most dangerous soul in any parish is not the one who stopped praying, it is the one who never stopped." When the friar asked him to explain, Padre Pio said this: "The soul that stopped praying knows it is lost and may return. The soul that keeps praying while hiding the sin, that soul believes the prayer is enough. And that belief is the deepest trap the enemy has ever set. Hold on, because what Padre Pio witnessed in that confessional over 50 years and more than 5 million confessions about the relationship between devout prayer and hidden sin is going to challenge everything you thought you understood about your spiritual life. My name is Margaret Ashford. I have spent more than 30 years studying the life, the testimonies, and the confessional records of Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. I was raised in Coventry, in an English Catholic household, where the faith was treated as something serious, not decorative, not sentimental, but serious. My mother kept the rosary on the kitchen table, not on a shelf. It was used daily without ceremony. And for most of my life I assumed, as most Catholics assume, that the prayer offered faithfully, regularly, sincerely was a protection, that the person who prayed was the person who was safe. Padre Pio taught me otherwise. What I am about to share comes from confessional testimonies, from private letters, from accounts given by those who sat across from him in that narrow wooden booth at San Giovanni Rotondo. What it reveals is not a condemnation of prayer. It is a revelation about what makes prayer real, and what, in Padre Pio's direct experience as a confessor, transforms sincere-sounding devotion into something that offends the very God it claims to honor. This is the teaching most Catholics never hear, and it may be the most important thing you will hear today. Let me begin with what Padre Pio could do that no ordinary confessor could do. In the Catholic tradition, the sacrament of confession operates through the priest acting as an instrument of God's mercy. He does not need to know the specifics of a sin to grant absolution, provided the penitent confesses with true contrition. Most priests hear what is said and act accordingly. Padre Pio did not work this way. From the earliest years of his priesthood, it was documented by his superiors, his fellow friars, and by the thousands of penitents who came from across Europe and the Americas, that Padre Pio could read souls. This is not a metaphor. He could perceive, with a faculty that his spiritual directors identified as a gift of infused knowledge, what was truly in the heart of the person seated before him. He could identify sins that had not been spoken. He could detect the difference between a confession made in true contrition and one made in what the Church calls imperfect attrition. The desire to avoid punishment without the genuine interior conversion. He used this gift, and he used it in ways that were sometimes deeply uncomfortable for those who experienced it. There are documented accounts, some published, some circulated privately among the Capuchin communities, of Padre Pio interrupting a penitent mid-confession to name a sin they had not mentioned, of sending people away from the confessional without absolution because he could see they had no firm purpose of amendment, of refusing on one memorable occasion to continue a confession when he told the woman seated before him, "You have said everything except the one thing that matters." She had been coming to confession every week for 9 months. She had been praying the Rosary daily. She attended Mass every morning. She was, to all outward appearances, one of the most devout women in her village. And Padre Pio had seen for 9 months the one sin she had never named, Hold on, because what he said to her next and what she discovered about her own prayer life that morning is the heart of what I need to share with you today. But first, let me explain the theological mechanism, because without this foundation, the story will not make the sense it needs to make. In Catholic theology, there is a distinction between what is called vocal prayer and what is called interior prayer. Vocal prayer is the prayer of the lips, the Rosary, the Divine Mercy Chaplet, the morning offering. Interior prayer is the orientation of the will and the affections toward God, the actual movement of the soul in its relationship with its Creator. The Church has always taught, and this is consistent throughout the tradition from Augustine to Aquinas to John of the Cross, that vocal prayer without interior prayer is empty. It is, as Saint Teresa of Avila wrote, like signing a letter you have never read. But Padre Pio went further than this. He taught, based on what he observed in 50 years of reading souls across that confessional, that there is a third condition, worse than empty prayer. He called it inverted prayer. Inverted prayer is not the prayer of the distracted person, the person whose mind wanders during the Rosary, the person who falls asleep during the Divine Mercy Chaplet. God is merciful toward weakness. Inverted prayer is something different. It is the prayer of the person who, in the hidden chamber of their own soul, knows they are hiding something from God, and prays anyway. Not out of ignorance, not out of weakness, but out of a deliberate, unspoken bargain. The prayer as a kind of payment, a kind of credential, a kind of currency that the soul uses to tell itself it is in good standing, while the hidden sin remains undisturbed. Padre Pio described this to his spiritual director, Padre Agostino, in a letter that has been partially published. He wrote, "I have seen souls in this confessional who have prayed without ceasing for years, and whose prayer rises no higher than the ceiling. Not because God does not hear it, God hears everything, but because the prayer was never truly addressed to Him. It was addressed to the image of God that the soul had constructed to justify its double life. The image of God that the soul has constructed. I need you to hear those words carefully, because this is what Padre Pio saw most frequently, most heartbreakingly, in the faithful who came to him. Not atheists, not people who had abandoned the Church, but people who had, gradually, without quite realizing it, replaced the true God with a more convenient version. A God who was satisfied with the outward forms of devotion. A God who received the Rosary as full payment for the sin that lived undisturbed in the back bedroom of the soul. This is the hidden sin that Padre Pio identified. Not always a specific act, but a specific posture. The posture of the soul that has divided itself into a public devotional life and a private concealed life, and has never allowed the two to meet in the light of a true and complete confession. Let me tell you what Padre Pio saw in that confessional, and let me tell you the cases, because it was never one case, never one sin, never one kind of person. The first category Padre Pio identified, the one he encountered most often, was the person of habitual hidden sin. Not a person who had sinned once and carried the guilt alone, but a person who had established a pattern, a secret, a habit, a relationship, a behavior that they had never brought into the confessional completely. There was a man, a prominent member of his parish in the 1940s, known for his public devotion, a daily communicant, who had been carrying for 6 years an act of theft that had ruined another family. Not a theft of objects, a theft of reputation. He had given false testimony in a legal dispute, knowing it was false, and the family on the other side had lost everything. He had confessed other sins regularly. He had prayed the Rosary without fail. But the false testimony, the sin that had real victims, the sin that required restitution, he had never named. When he finally came to Padre Pio for confession, he did not intend to name it. He came, as he always did, prepared to confess the smaller sins, the impatience, the angry word, the missed prayer. He sat down across from the saint, made the sign of the cross, and began. Padre Pio stopped him after the third sentence. He said, "Before you continue, there is a family in your village whose ruin bears your name. You know what I am speaking of." The man was silent for a long time. According to the account that was later given by a Capuchin friar who had heard it from the man's son, the silence lasted several minutes. Then the man began to weep. He told Padre Pio that he had never named it because naming it would require restitution, and restitution would require disclosure. And disclosure would destroy everything he had built, his business, his reputation, the life his family now lived. Padre Pio was quiet. Then he said something that the man's son described decades later as the most important thing his father ever heard. He said, "You have been praying for 6 years that God would bless a life built on the ruin of others, and you have wondered, have you not, why God seems distant, why the rosary feels like stones in your mouth, why you come to Mass every day and leave no different than when you arrived." The man said yes. He had wondered all of these things. He had assumed it was his own spiritual dryness. He had prayed harder. He had added more devotions. Padre Pio said, the prayer was not failing. The prayer was working exactly as it should. It was showing you the distance between where you are and where God is. Every rosary you prayed was an accurate reading of your spiritual state. You interpreted the dryness as an absence of God. It was the presence of God, refusing to pretend that your life was in order. Hold on. Because what Padre Pio said next turns everything most Catholics believe about spiritual dryness completely upside down. He said, the prayer of a soul in this state does not ascend, it circles back. Every bead of the rosary you have prayed in this state has been a mirror held up to the sin you would not name. God receives nothing because nothing has been surrendered. The prayer has become a rehearsal of your own righteousness rather than a turning toward His. I want you to sit with that, because it is not what we are taught. We are taught that prayer is always good, always valuable, always heard. And in one sense, this is true. God hears everything. But Padre Pio was drawing a distinction between being heard and being received, between the sound of prayer reaching heaven and the soul of prayer arriving there. And he was saying something that the tradition, if you read it carefully, has always said, that prayer offered in bad faith, not ignorant prayer, not weak prayer, but deliberate double life prayer, is not a spiritual asset. It is, in the word that he used with absolute precision, a mockery. Now let me tell you about the second category, and this one I suspect will touch far more of you than the first. Because the first category, the person concealing a specific act, a specific crime, is relatively uncommon. Most Catholics are not hiding a financial theft or a false testimony, but the second category is everywhere. Padre Pio called it the sin of incompleteness, and he encountered it in his own estimate in the majority of the confessions he heard over his lifetime. This is what I've seen with my own eyes in decades of working with Catholic communities. The person who goes to confession regularly, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly, and who confesses faithfully but always stops just short of the one thing. Not a forgotten sin, not an inadvertent omission, a deliberate boundary, a line they draw in their interior life and do not cross, even in the confessional. It is almost always the sin they have the most invested in keeping. For some people, it is an addiction to alcohol, to pornography, to substances that they have named in confession but without any true intent to stop. They receive absolution. They know as they receive it that they will be back in the same place within days, and they tell themselves, at least I'm confessing, at least I'm not walking away entirely. For others, it is unforgiveness. A hatred of a specific person, often a family member, often rooted in something real and deep that they have never truly brought before God. They may mention difficulty forgiving in the confessional, But they do not name the person. They do not describe the hatred in its full dimensions. They offer the surface of it and keep the depths. For others, and this is the category Padre Pio identified as most common among the outwardly devout, it is pride. The specific pride of the person who has constructed their entire identity around their Catholic practice and who cannot confess the full reality of their spiritual state, because to do so would be to admit that the identity is, in part, a performance. Padre Pio described this kind of penitent in sharp terms. He said to Padre Benedetto, the Capuchin friar, whose records I referenced in an earlier account, "The devout person who confesses everything except their devotion is the most closed of all, because they have made their closeness into a virtue." This reminds me of something I experienced in my own life. When I was in my 40s, I was part of a prayer group that met weekly, a dedicated, faithful group of Catholic women. We prayed together, we studied scripture together, we went to Mass together. And I noticed over several years a pattern in myself that I was reluctant to name. I had a deep and specific resentment toward a woman in that group, not a dramatic resentment, not hatred in the obvious sense, but a persistent, quiet judgment. A habit of measuring myself against her and finding her wanting, a tendency to interpret her words uncharitably, to notice her failings with something close to satisfaction. I confessed impatience, I confessed pride in general terms, but I never in those years brought that woman's name into the confessional. I never said, I resent her specifically, I judge her specifically, I am grateful in some quiet, terrible way when she fails. And I prayed the Rosary every day during those years. I went to daily Mass when I could. I read and studied and spoke about the spiritual life with what I believed was sincerity. Padre Pio's words, when I finally read them, hit me like cold water, because I understood then that my prayer during those years had been precisely what he described, a performance of spiritual identity over a specific, deliberate concealment. And I had not even had the honesty to acknowledge to myself that I was concealing anything. That is the subtlety of the hidden sin Padre Pio is speaking about. It does not always announce itself as a sin. It presents itself as a preference, a personality trait, a reasonable response to a real provocation. And the prayer continues, and the concealment continues, and the distance from God continues, and the soul attributes it to anything except the one true cause. Now, here is the reversal, and this is where Padre Pio's teaching becomes something I think you will carry with you for a long time. Most Catholics, when they experience spiritual dryness, when the Rosary feels mechanical, when Mass feels empty, when prayer produces nothing, respond by doing more. More rosaries, more novenas, more devotions, more external religious activity piled on top of the deficit. And Padre Pio said this response, while understandable, is exactly backward. He said, more prayer does not fill a vessel that has a hole in it. It only makes the emptying more visible. The spiritual dryness that accompanies the hidden sin is not a problem to be solved by adding more devotion. It is a message. It is the most merciful and accurate message that God sends to a soul in this state. The prayer you are offering is honest about where you are. And where you are is separated from me by the thing you have not named. The dryness is not an absence of God. It is the presence of God, present enough to refuse to pretend. Let me tell you what happened to the man in that confessional, the man whose false testimony had ruined a family, because his story ends not in despair, but in something that Padre Pio called the second conversion, rarer and more costly than the first, and infinitely more real. After the long silence, after the weeping, the man told Padre Pio that he could not do restitution. He could not disclose. The cost was too high. Padre Pio did not argue. He did not threaten. He said, I understand. The cost is high. That is the nature of real sin. It always costs more to repair than to commit. But let me ask you something. The prayer you have been praying for 6 years, the Rosary, the Mass, the novenas. What were you asking for in all of that prayer? The man thought. For peace, he said. I was asking for peace. Padre Pio said, and did the peace come? A long silence. Then, no. No, Padre Pio agreed, because you were asking for the fruit of the surrender you had not yet made. Peace is not granted before the surrender. It is the consequence of it. You were asking God to give you the reward of an act you had not yet performed, and God, in His mercy, refused. I have read that exchange many times, and each time I read it, I understand more fully what Padre Pio meant when he said that the most dangerous soul in a parish is not the one who stopped praying. It is the one who kept praying while the hidden sin remained hidden, because that soul has constructed the most elaborate possible defense against the very conversion it claims to seek. The man asked, "What do I do?" Padre Pio said 3 things, not 12. Not a complicated spiritual program. 3 things. First, name the sin completely. Not a dishonesty, not something I did years ago. The specific act, the specific harm, the specific victims. God already knows. You are not informing Him. You are performing the act of surrender in the only way that makes it real, by speaking it aloud in the presence of a witness. Second, accept the penance not as punishment but as repair. Penance is not God punishing you. Penance is God showing you the path back to the person you were before the sin. Do not resent it. It is the road. Third, take the first step toward restitution. Even if you cannot yet see the full cost, you do not need to know how you will make it right before you begin. You only need to take the first step that is available to you today. God will show you the next one after that. The man left that confessional in a condition that all the accounts described the same way, devastated and yet somehow lighter, as though something he had been carrying for 6 years had been set down, not because the consequences had disappeared, but because the carrying was over. His son, who told the account decades later, said that his father spent the next 2 years in a process of gradual, painful, costly restitution. He did not disclose publicly, but he contacted the family privately. He returned what he could. He acknowledged what he could not return, and his son said his father became a different man, not a perfect man, not a man without struggle, but a man whose prayer, finally, was addressed to the real God and not to the constructed image. He said, "My father used to come home from Mass looking the same as when he left. For the last 10 years of his life, he came home from Mass looking like he had been somewhere." That is what Padre Pio was describing. The difference between prayer that circles back and prayer that arrives. The difference between devotion that maintains a performance and prayer that actually reaches God. Let me now speak directly to those of you who recognize something in what I have said. Maybe it is the specific pattern of the man with the hidden testimony, a specific act, a specific harm that has never fully entered the confessional. Maybe it is the pattern I described from my own life, the specific person, the specific resentment that lives under the surface of an otherwise devout life. Maybe it is something else entirely, the hidden addiction, the concealed relationship, the deliberately incomplete confession that you have offered week after week, knowing it is incomplete, accepting the absolution that you suspect, on some level, may not be valid. Padre Pio had one message for all of these cases, and it was not a message of condemnation. It was a message of the most direct and urgent mercy. He said, God is not waiting for you to become worthy of His forgiveness. He is waiting for you to stop pretending you already have it. Stop pretending you already have it. Not stop praying, not stop coming to Mass, not abandon the Rosary or the novenas or the devotions that have, even in their distorted form, kept you tethered to the Church. But name the thing. Bring it into the confessional, the real thing, the specific thing, the thing you have been protecting with every bead of every rosary you have ever prayed. Because Padre Pio promised, and this is documented in multiple accounts, that what waits on the other side of that naming is not punishment. It is not shame. It is the peace that you have been asking for in prayer for years, without understanding why it never came. He told one woman, after she finally named the thing she had carried for 20 years, "You have just prayed your first real prayer." Your first real prayer. After 20 years of daily rosaries, after decades of Mass and novenas and feast days observed without fail, the first real one was the one that cost something. You just discovered something that Padre Pio spent 50 years trying to bring to the surface in that confessional, something that most Catholics carry for years, even decades, without ever understanding what it is costing them spiritually. In these past few minutes, you have seen the mechanism of the hidden sin, the way it inverts prayer, and the exact path that Padre Pio described back to the God whose real presence you have been praying toward without quite reaching. Padre Pio said those who spread these truths would be protected by their mission. These accounts, from confessional records, from private letters, from testimonies circulated among the Capuchin friars, were never meant to remain locked in archives. They were meant for you, for the person sitting in a pew right now who knows there is a thing that hasn't been named. The Super Thanks button below this video is not just financial support for this channel. It is your participation in getting this message to the next person who needs to hear it. To the person who has prayed the Rosary every day for 20 years and still feels God is far away. To the person who is one honest confession away from the peace they have been asking for in prayer. You are not just a viewer, you are a guardian of these revelations. Every soul this message reaches is a soul that Padre Pio reached through you. Now let me give you the practical steps, the specific, concrete things you can do today, not tomorrow, not at the next scheduled confession, but today. Step 1. Perform what the tradition calls an examination of conscience, not the abbreviated version, but the full version. Sit quietly in a place where you will not be interrupted and ask yourself this question with complete honesty. Is there something in my life that I have never fully named in confession, not a sin I forgot? Not a sin I was unaware of, a sin I have been protecting. Take as long as you need with that question. Padre Pio said the examination of conscience was not a formality to be performed in 2 minutes before entering the confessional. It was a genuine interior interrogation conducted in the presence of God, in which the soul was asked to look at itself without the defenses it normally maintains. If something surfaces, and for many of you, something will surface, because Padre Pio's observation was that almost every soul carries something. Do not push it back down. Do not rationalize it. Do not tell yourself it is not serious enough to confess, or too old to be relevant, or too complicated to explain. Write it down if that helps you hold on to it. Step 2, make a specific, complete confession. Not your regular confession, a confession in which you bring the thing that you have never fully brought before. Padre Pio was clear. The absolution you receive over a hidden sin is not invalid because the priest is unaware of it. God knows, but the grace of the sacrament cannot fully penetrate a soul that is not fully open. The partial confession produces partial healing. The complete confession produces what Padre Pio called the clearing, the interior sensation of a space being emptied of something that had been taking up room there for a very long time. If you are afraid of what the priest will say, go to a priest you do not know, drive to a different parish, use the anonymity of the grill if your church still has one. Padre Pio, who could read souls, was never harsher toward the person who confessed than toward the person who concealed. He was fiercest toward those who pretended. To those who finally named the thing, he was, by every account that exists, extraordinarily gentle. Step 3. Pray the Rosary tonight with one specific intention, not for peace in general, not for God's blessing on your life in general. Pray it with this specific intention. Lord, whatever I have been protecting from you, I am no longer willing to protect it. I am willing to be made clean. You do not need to have the solution figured out before you pray this. You do not need to know how the restitution will work, or what the disclosure will cost, or how the habit will be broken. You only need to be willing to begin. Padre Pio said, God does not require perfection as the condition of his mercy. He requires only the willingness to move toward him. And the first genuine movement, even the most faltering step, even the prayer offered in trembling, reaches him. He is already waiting at the place the step is going. Step 4. Return to Mass with different eyes. If you have been attending Mass while carrying the hidden sin, you have been standing at the threshold of the greatest grace available on earth and receiving only a fraction of it, because the door was not fully open. After the confession, attend Mass not as a credential or a credential, not as the performance of the identity of the faithful Catholic, but as the act of a soul that has just set something down and wants to receive what it could not receive while carrying it. Padre Pio spent 12 hours a day in that confessional, not because he enjoyed hearing sins, but because he knew what waited on the other side of a complete confession. He had seen it thousands of times. The transformation of a soul that arrives at the sacrament fully open is in his description visible, not metaphorically but literally visible. The face changes, the posture changes, something that was closed becomes open. The prayer that circled back begins to ascend. Step 5. Let the dryness become your compass, not your despair. If after all you have done, after the examination and the confession and the renewed intention, you still feel the dryness, do not interpret it as failure. Padre Pio taught that the soul which has carried a hidden sin for a long time does not become instantly transparent to grace after a single confession. There is a period of restoration. The channel, long blocked, does not flow at full capacity immediately, but it flows. And the dryness during this period is not the same dryness as before. Before, it was the accurate reading of a soul in concealment. After, it is the natural process of a soul in repair. And the way to tell the difference, Padre Pio said, is this: the dryness of concealment always produces anxiety. The dryness of restoration produces something that is hard to name, but recognizable. A kind of patience with the process, a sense that the direction is right, even when the feeling is not yet there. Remember what Padre Pio said to the man who had carried his sin for 6 years. God, in his mercy, refused to give him the peace he prayed for while the sin remained hidden. Not because God was punishing him, because God was telling him, in the only language available to a soul that would not listen to words, that the peace was real and it was on the other side of the surrender. The surrender is available to you today, not when the sin is fully repaired, not when you have figured out the restitution, not when you feel ready. Today, in the examination, in the intention, in the first honest movement of the will toward the thing that has been closed. Padre Pio said, I have never in 50 years sent away a penitent who came to me in true sincerity. However grave the sin, however long the delay, I have sent away many who came to me in performance. The difference is known immediately, and it is not known by me. It is known by the one who sees everything, the one who sees everything. The one whose presence in the prayer you have been offering has been, all this time, the thing that made the dryness possible. Because he was there. He was receiving your prayer. He was measuring the distance between the prayer you offered and the soul that offered it. And he was, in his infinite patience, waiting. He is still waiting. Write clean heart in the comments if you have decided today to bring the thing you have been carrying into the light of a full confession. I read every comment, and I believe that the act of writing those 2 words will be the first step of a confession that changes everything. And if you know someone, a spouse, a friend, a family member, who has been praying faithfully for years and still feels God is far away, share this video with them, not as a judgment, as the gift it is, the teaching of a saint who spent 50 years in a confessional and knew, better than anyone alive in the 20th century, what stands between a soul and the God it is reaching toward. Padre Pio's words to the man who had finally confessed, after 6 years, "You have just prayed your first real prayer. May today be the day you pray yours."